From the first moment you hear his name, James Toback, the story feels tangled in both glamour and unease. Imagine yourself stepping into Park City during Sundance in the early 2000s. The cold air crisp, snow crunching underfoot, film posters plastered against walls, and ambitious actors darting between coffee shops and makeshift screening rooms. In that environment, Toback moved with the practiced ease of a man who had once been nominated for an Academy Award, his conversational style as fast, sharp, and seemingly insightful as his scripts. You hear how he could sit across from someone in a cafe or on a park bench, spinning promises of introductions, opportunities, screen tests, or life-changing auditions. To a young performer, it sounded like destiny calling. To critics, it was part of the mystique of a writer-director who never quite broke into Hollywood's elite, but always hovered on its edge. But years later, that same mystique would unravel into hundreds of allegations of sexual misconduct, with Toback accused of luring women under the guise of career advancement. Welcome to 102 Hours. Tonight, you'll drift into the unsettling corridors of James Toback. Power, interviews, and accusations. I'll be your quiet guide, a voice in the dim room, gently laying out the intersections of art, charm, and darker allegations that reshaped Hollywood's reckoning. As you listen, remember to like and subscribe so you never miss these whispered journeys through truth and mystery. And if you'd like, leave your location and local time in the comments. It is always a comfort to know where in the world you re-listening from, keeping company with strangers in the small hours. In those early Sundance days, Toback's reputation was not just about his films, but also about his relentless pursuit of conversation. Friends described him as an interviewer of life itself, someone who could lock eyes and make you feel like the only person in the room. This was not unusual in a film industry where charisma often paved the way before talent had a chance to prove itself. The historical fact that Sundance grew from a small independent festival in the 1970s to an international powerhouse by the 2000s adds color to his backdrop, an event where power dynamics between hopefuls and veterans were at their sharpest. Yet, tucked into this glittering growth was a fringe tidbit. Toback was rumored to walk the streets with a notebook, scribbling impressions, questions, even intimate details of people he'd just met, as if cataloging lives for later use. Investigators still question whether the very setting of film festivals, ephemeral, charged, and brimming with ambition, allowed someone like Toback to build a strategy that blurred the line between professional interest and personal pursuit. To be clear, Toback has denied wrongdoing throughout, insisting many encounters were consensual or fabricated. But you sitting here in the hush of late night can almost see the collision course beginning. One man with power over stories, hundreds of women with stories of their own, and a city built on both illusion and exposure. The stage is set, the lights dim, and the whisper of scandal is about to grow louder. Picture the rhythm of a conversation with James Toback. You're seated across from him, perhaps in Central Park or a diner booth, where he leans in close and speaks with the intensity of someone convinced every word matters. He didn't just ask about your dreams, he dissected them. He pressed about your fears, your past, your body, your ambitions, all while dangling the possibility of a film role or a career-making introduction. This was the so-called art of his interview, a performance in itself. To some, it seemed like a masterclass in human curiosity. To others, especially many women who later came forward, it felt like a trap disguised as an audition for intimacy. His technique was as much about control as it was about connection, and that blurred line became the crux of many accusations. On paper, Toback's career gave him credibility. He wrote Bugsy, which earned him an Academy Award nomination, and directed films like The Pickup Artist and Two Girls and a Guy. In an industry where titles often matter more than box office results, those credits made him sound like a gatekeeper worth listening to. And the historical fact is this: Hollywood has long functioned on the notion of mentorships and chance encounters, where a single conversation can lead to a breakthrough. From the outside, Toback's one-on-one sessions fit into that cultural script. But as stories later revealed, These encounters rarely led to auditions or roles. They led to accusations of harassment, intimidation, and psychological manipulation. The quirky tidbit here is almost unsettling in its irony. Toback often bragged that he had interviewed thousands of women, treating it like a research project for his films. Some reports suggest he kept mental tallies, framing it as a blend of anthropology and casting. He presented himself as a philosopher of desire, but critics saw something far more predatory. It as the kind of detail you'd expect from a fictional character in a noir novel, yet it surfaced repeatedly in accounts from real women who described being approached in parks, gyms, or coffee shops. Investigators still question whether Toback's interviewing technique was a conscious strategy to disarm and control, or simply a habit born of obsession with human psychology. Either way, it blurred professional lines in ways that left people feeling cornered. He has consistently denied these interpretations, insisting he was misunderstood, exaggerations had spun out of control, or that encounters were consensual. But when you lean back and hear the cadence of these stories, you sense how his so-called interviews became less about art and more about the unsettling power of suggestion. You can almost hear the silence after he'd say, "I can change your life." For many, it was a silence heavy with hope. For others, as time passed, it became a silence filled with regret and unease. In that quiet gap between promise and reality lies the shadow that would soon grow into hundreds of accusations, reshaping not only his career but the very way Hollywood began to reckon with conversations that once seemed harmless, but now echo with unease. You picture yourself on a studio lot or at a dinner party, where whispers thread their way between clinking glasses and half-finished scripts. For years, James Toback's name floated in this quiet rumor mill, mentioned in the kind of sideways glances, and hushed tones that never made the trades but circulated among actors, assistants, and hopefuls. Hollywood has always had its undercurrents, an open secret culture where stories about powerful men circulated like currency, traded for warnings or passed off as gossip. In Toback's case, the whispers revolved around his habit of approaching women in public spaces, offering interviews that blurred into something else. People knew, but they didn't say it loudly, not until the culture around silence began to shift. The historical fact here is that Hollywood in the late 20th century was rife with unspoken codes of survival. If you were an actress trying to make it, you quickly learned who to avoid, whose office to leave a door open in, and which mentors required careful navigation. The entertainment industry's unregulated power dynamics created fertile ground for rumors that rarely became formal complaints. In Toback's case, those whispers often described patterns: chance encounters in Central Park, long phone calls, promises that melted away. They were the kind of stories easy to dismiss without evidence, easy to chalk up to misunderstandings, until the sheer number of them could no longer be ignored. A fringe tidbit that reveals how open this knowledge was comes from magazine profiles of Toback himself. Journalists occasionally hinted at his unconventional way of casting, or of constantly approaching strangers. These hints read differently now, like puzzles hiding in plain sight. To his admirers, he was eccentric, brilliant, even fearless about human connection. To his critics, those same behaviors carried undertones that made people uneasy. The fact that both interpretations coexisted for decades shows how Hollywood tolerated contradictions when talent or charm were involved. Investigators still question whether those early whispers could have triggered intervention had anyone with institutional power paid closer attention. Was it fear of lawsuits, lack of evidence, or just willful ignorance that kept studios and agencies from acting? Whatever the answer, the silence persisted. Toback continued to move through film festivals and screenings, still striking up conversations, still presenting himself as a conduit to careers. And for years, little stood in his way. When you sit with this part of the story, you can almost feel the tension of a room where everyone knows something they were not saying out loud. It's a peculiar kind of silence, one that presses against your ears and makes your skin prickle. In that silence, rumors festered and grew until a cultural shift, sparked by other high-profile revelations, finally gave them space to break into daylight. What had once been dismissed as gossip was about to become headlines, and the murmur of whispers would transform into the roar of hundreds of voices refusing to be ignored. The break came in October 2017, when the Los Angeles Times published its bombshell investigation. You imagine the newsroom on that morning, reporters' phones buzzing, inboxes flooding, editors tightening headlines that would soon ripple through Hollywood. The article named James Toback and laid out allegations from 38 women, each account describing a pattern of encounters that began with promises of career opportunities and ended with claims of harassment or coercion. Overnight, whispers became a thunderclap, and the story jumped from private warning to public scandal. Within days, the number of accusers swelled to nearly 400, their stories filling inboxes faster than journalists could sort them. The once esoteric director of Fingers and Two Girls and a Guy was suddenly at the center of one of Hollywood's largest waves of allegations. The historical fact that makes this moment even sharper is its timing. Just weeks earlier, the Harvey Weinstein scandal had broken, reshaping conversations about power, silence, and accountability in the entertainment world. The Toback expose landed into that cultural upheaval, amplifying the shock. It wasn't just another story. It was part of a larger reckoning where survivors' voices were suddenly being heard, and industry power brokers were forced to confront decades of silence. To read the Times that day was to feel a hinge turning in real time, one headline swinging the door open wider than before. A quirky tidbit tucked inside this reporting was Toback's own immediate response. He dismissed the allegations as biologically impossible, citing health conditions like diabetes and a heart problem that he said prevented him from engaging in the acts described. He even suggested that many women were fabricating stories or confusing consensual encounters with misconduct. The phrasing was unusual, almost surreal, and it only fueled further headlines. Instead of closing the matter, his denials became part of the narrative, strange counterpoints to the flood of testimony. Investigators still question whether the sheer scale of the allegations, hundreds spanning decades, should have triggered earlier scrutiny from law enforcement or industry watchdogs. Why had complaints never surfaced formally, despite the consistency of the stories? The answer circles back to power, stigma, and an industry culture that often asked women to quietly endure or move on, rather than challenge a gatekeeper. Whatever the reasons, by 2017 the stories had finally broken free. You sit here listening, and it's easy to imagine how shocking those headlines must have felt. Like a dam bursting, a cascade too large to push back. The expose didn't just reveal the alleged misconduct of one man. It marked another turning point in a broader reckoning, one that made Hollywood's carefully guarded illusions tremble. For James Toback, a career built on words and persuasion was now being dismantled by words of a very different kind. Hundreds of voices speaking, louder than his denials could drown out. When the flood of accusations finally reached prosecutors, many believed the next step would be clear: charges, trials, justice. But what came instead was silence from the courts, a legal vacuum that frustrated survivors and baffled the public. In 2018, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office reviewed multiple complaints against James Toback. After careful evaluation, they declined to file charges in several cases, citing the statute of limitations, lack of corroborating evidence, or unwillingness of witnesses to move forward. To you, sitting in the dimness of late night, it feels like the harsh mechanics of the law grinding against lived experience. Survivors had risked going public, yet the cases vanished before ever reaching a courtroom. The historical fact here is unavoidable. Many states, including California at the time, limited how far back prosecutors could reach in cases of sexual assault or harassment. Before reforms inspired by the Me Too movement, survivors often had only a few years to report, a window far too narrow for those silenced by fear, shame, or the risks of retaliation. Toback's alleged misconduct stretched back decades, which meant the legal clock had long since run out. The DA's office could acknowledge the accounts but not prosecute them. To those listening, it was a bitter reminder that legal systems often lag behind cultural reckonings. And then comes the quirky tidbit, one that feels almost too cinematic. Toback reportedly continued walking the streets of New York after the allegations surfaced, still approaching women, still introducing himself as a filmmaker. Some accounts claimed he even referenced the news stories, brushing them off with a laugh or framing them as misunderstandings blown out of proportion. To some, it was brazen. To others, a sign of denial so complete it bordered on performance art. Investigators still question whether those early prosecutorial decisions inadvertently emboldened him, sending a message that accusations alone could not topple his freedom of movement. Without charges, Toback retained the veneer of legality, even as his reputation eroded. Survivors were left in limbo, believed by journalists but denied a day in court. In that limbo, you sense a peculiar tension. The machinery of justice paused, while the machinery of public opinion surged ahead. For those who had told their stories, the refusal to prosecute stung as much as the initial silence. And for those who still wondered if speaking out was worth it, the outcome felt like confirmation that the law had little room for memory, only for dates stamped on calendars. The door of criminal accountability had closed, but another path, civil litigation, was about to creak open. The door that criminal law had shut was nudged open again in civil court. You picture the marble halls of a New York courthouse in late 2022, footsteps echoing as a group of women filed their complaint. The lawsuit named not only James Toback but also the Harvard Club of New York City, a private members-only institution where some of the alleged misconduct took place. At the heart of the filing were accusations of harassment, coercion, false imprisonment, and sexual assault stretching across decades. The plaintiffs, initially a handful, later expanding to 40, argued that Toback used his status and connections to lure them into vulnerable situations. Unlike the criminal cases, this time the law allowed their voices to be heard. The historical fact that made this lawsuit possible was the passage of New York's Adult Survivors Act in 2022. The legislation created a one-year look-back window, enabling survivors of sexual assault to file civil claims that had previously been barred by statutes of limitations. The act reshaped legal terrain overnight. For Toback's accusers, it offered a narrow but vital chance to seek accountability. And so, years after the first headlines, the case of James Toback, power, interviews, and accusations returned to the spotlight. Not in Hollywood, but in a courtroom. The quirky tidbit here involves the Harvard Club itself, a venerable institution founded in 1865 and known for its oak-paneled rooms and elite membership. The plaintiffs argued that Toback used the club's spaces to project legitimacy, as though the setting itself validated his promises. It's an almost surreal image. Beneath portraits of Harvard's past presidents, in a building designed for scholars and networking, women say they were cornered into situations that felt anything but safe. Investigators still question whether elite institutions bear responsibility when their spaces are allegedly misused for coercion. Could the club have monitored, intervened, or restricted access? Or was it simply an unwitting backdrop, its prestige exploited by a single individual? The civil lawsuit pressed those questions into public debate, making the case larger than just one man's actions. As you sit with this moment, you sense how the women's stories, once confined to whispers and newspaper pages, were now inscribed into legal documents, their details subject to cross-examination and juror judgment. The courtroom stripped away the glamour of interviews and film credits, leaving only testimony, dates, and sworn statements. What began as rumor had grown into journalism. What journalism couldn't prosecute had turned into litigation, and the cycle of silence was breaking in a new and undeniable way. Imagine stepping into the Harvard Club of New York City, its grand staircase polished by decades of wealthy footsteps, the air tinged with leather chairs, mahogany wood, and the faint aroma of brandy. This was no Hollywood backlot. It was an emblem of prestige, a sanctuary for the educated elite. Yet in the lawsuit against James Toback, the club emerged not as a symbol of learning but as a stage for alleged coercion. Plaintiffs described being invited to private rooms, interviews that started with career talk but turned toward uncomfortable advances. To them, the club's aura of legitimacy made refusal harder. Its hushed exclusivity wrapped troubling moments in the camouflage of respectability. The historical fact here is that private clubs like the Harvard Club have long played a role in America's professional networks. Founded in 1865, the club expanded in the 20th century to become a hub for business deals and social climbing, a place where connections mattered as much as credentials. That kind of exclusivity carried weight. If someone invited you there, it suggested authority, influence, a door opening. For Toback, according to the allegations, it gave him a backdrop of power. For his accusers, it became a space they later described as intimidating, where they felt trapped by circumstance and by walls heavy with history. A quirky tidbit deepens the irony. The Harvard Club once advertised itself as a place where members could bring guests of merit to share in intellectual and social pursuits. Yet, some plaintiffs claimed they were treated not as guests but as targets, their merit reduced to vulnerability in the face of Toback's promises. To walk through a room meant for scholars and philanthropists, only to feel cornered by the very person who had invited you, added a surreal twist to an already disorienting experience. Investigators still question whether the club should be held accountable. Did its staff notice patterns? Should institutions be responsible when prestige is used as a lure? The lawsuit framed the club not as the perpetrator, but as an enabler, whether knowingly or not. For many survivors, naming the club alongside Toback was symbolic. It underscored how abuse often hides behind powerful institutions that, intentionally or otherwise, give cover. Sitting with this, you sense how space itself becomes a character in the story. The Harvard Club, with its vaulted ceilings and silent corridors, wasn't just a backdrop. It was part of the alleged strategy. When women walked in, they stepped into an environment where saying no felt like breaking more than just a conversation. It felt like breaking a code of deference to power. In that way, the club became as haunting as the man who brought them there. A reminder that sometimes the setting of a story speaks as loudly as the people within it. Now you find yourself listening to the other side of the courtroom, where James Toback's voice enters the record not as a filmmaker, but as a defendant. His defense strategy unfolded like a script written in fragments, part denial, part medical explanation, part attack on credibility. Over and over, he insisted that many of the encounters described were consensual. Where memory blurred, he claimed he could not recall ever meeting certain accusers at all. And, in the most unusual twist, he pointed to his health. With diabetes, a heart condition, and what he described as physical limitations, Toback argued that some of the acts described were, in his words, biologically impossible. For jurors, these claims raised more questions than they answered, painting a picture of a man attempting to construct reasonable doubt in a civil context where reasonable doubt wasn't even the bar. The historical fact worth noting here is how defenses like these fit a larger pattern in public scandals. Figures accused of misconduct often lean on three familiar strategies: denial of memory, insistence on consent, or medical impossibility. From politicians to entertainers, history is dotted with cases where the body itself is presented as alibi. Toback's appeals to illness placed him in that lineage, echoing strategies seen in other high-profile cases where defendants sought to shift attention from patterns of testimony to technicalities of capability. The quirky tidbit lies in how Toback's own past contradicted his medical claims. Journalists unearthed accounts of him boasting about his stamina and intensity, describing marathon conversations with strangers or long walks across Central Park where he approached dozens of women a day. The juxtaposition was jarring. A man once proud of his vitality now leaning heavily on fragility as a shield. To the public, it sounded less like irony and more like a story collapsing under its own inconsistencies. Investigators still question whether jurors and judges ever truly weighed his health defenses as credible, or if they were seen as desperate attempts to explain away the impossible-to-ignore pattern of testimony. Civil court, after all, relies on the balance of probabilities rather than proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Against dozens of voices, Toback's denials and medical defenses seemed thin. And yet, to hear them spoken aloud was to witness a man who once crafted stories for the screen, now attempting to script his own exoneration. You sit in the quiet of this retelling and sense the fragility of those defenses, words stretched thin against the weight of collective memory. It's almost as if his strategy tried to erase time itself, to deny not only what happened, but whether it could have happened at all. But memory, once ignored, had found its way into court, and its chorus was about to deliver a verdict measured not just in words, but in billions. Then came April 9th, 2025, a date that would be etched in civil litigation history. You can almost hear the echoing gavel as the jury in New York deliberated over the claims of 40 women who had accused James Toback of harassment, coercion, and psychological abuse spanning decades. When the verdict was announced, the courtroom gasped. A $168 billion judgment awarded to the plaintiffs, one of the largest civil awards in U.S. history. To you, listening in the quiet of night, it feels almost surreal. Numbers so large they strain comprehension, yet representing the weight of lived experiences finally recognized in the halls of justice. The historical fact here is significant. While criminal convictions carry jail time, civil awards like this operate on the principle of compensatory and punitive damages. They acknowledge harm, seek restitution, and, in some cases, aim to deter future misconduct. The sheer size of Toback's judgment sent shockwaves through Hollywood and beyond, signaling that accountability doesn't only come in the form of criminal prosecution. It can also arrive in the form of civil recognition and financial reckoning. A fringe tidbit underlines the scale of public fascination. Some coverage compared the $1.68 billion to the total box office of Toback's entire filmography, noting the irony that the award dwarfed any financial success he had achieved as a filmmaker. It's an almost literary juxtaposition. The very medium that had once legitimized his presence now overshadowed by the consequences of alleged misuse of trust. The headlines blared not just the sum, but the scope, reinforcing that decades of allegations cannot simply be erased with charm or denial. Investigators still question whether the verdict will withstand appeal, or how Toback will satisfy such a monumental judgment. Will insurers cover any portion, or will this remain largely symbolic? The legal process continues to unfold, even as the public interprets the case as a milestone in survivors' ability to confront powerful figures through civil law. You feel the weight of that moment. For 40 women, for those who had waited decades to be heard, this judgment was more than numbers. It was acknowledgement, a measure of validation that had long been denied. And for those listening now, you understand how power, charisma, and silence collided over decades, only to be confronted by testimony, law, and collective persistence. The billion-dollar verdict was not the end of Toback's story, but it marked a decisive turn in the narrative, one where voices previously muted could finally echo with consequence. The public reaction to the Toback verdict was as multifaceted as the allegations themselves. You can imagine scrolling through social media feeds, watching commentary on cable news, and reading op-eds from actors, journalists, and legal analysts. Some hailed the outcome as a monumental step for survivors, evidence that even the most powerful figures could face accountability in civil court. Others expressed skepticism about the astronomical damages, debating whether such sums were realistic or symbolic. The story quickly became a lightning rod for debates about consent, power, and the role of civil litigation in addressing decades-old misconduct. The historical fact here is that Hollywood has rarely faced collective accountability in this way. While the Me Too movement exposed many individuals, the Toback verdict stands out for its civil scope and its numerical impact. It demonstrates how legal mechanisms, combined with societal shifts in awareness, can finally intersect to produce results long delayed. The cultural resonance of this case lies not just in Toback's personal story, but in the broader message it sends. Power and charisma are not immunity, and silence can eventually be challenged. A quirky tidbit emerged from public commentary. Some journalists noted the contrast between Toback's media image and the courtroom reality, describing him in one breath as a film poet and in the next as a man entangled in a billion-dollar judgment. It's a reminder of how public personas can fracture when scrutinized under the weight of accumulated testimony. For casual observers, the dissonance between fame and accountability was almost theatrical, a real-life drama playing out far beyond the silver screen. Investigators still question whether such public attention might influence future civil claims, either encouraging survivors to step forward or complicating juror impartiality in related cases. Could the sheer notoriety of this verdict reshape the way institutions handle allegations? Could it embolden other survivors across industries to pursue similar legal recourse? These questions linger, reflecting the ongoing ripple effects of Toback's case. You sit in this moment of public reaction, noting how the narrative has expanded beyond courtroom walls into collective consciousness. The discourse is uneven, often messy, but undeniably powerful. For those watching, it is a lesson in the intersection of fame, law, and accountability. A cautionary tale that echoes beyond film festivals, beyond New York, into every space where power can be exercised over ambition, trust, and desire. The verdict may be civil, but its resonance feels far-reaching, and its consequences continue to shape the conversation around Hollywood and beyond. As the dust settled, the Toback case began to be seen as part of a broader reckoning in Hollywood. You can almost feel the subtle shifts. Casting directors reconsidering the people they invite into private offices, agents briefing clients on warning signs, studios revisiting policies about one-on-one meetings and mentorships. The case became a touchstone, frequently cited alongside the Weinstein scandal and other high-profile allegations, illustrating the systemic nature of abuse and the importance of institutional safeguards. It wasn't just about Toback. It was about patterns, cultures, and the power dynamics that allowed such behavior to persist for decades. The historical fact is that the Me Too movement and similar waves of advocacy reshaped American workplaces, legal structures, and public perception around sexual misconduct. The Toback verdict exemplifies the intersection of law, social awareness, and institutional accountability, showing that even individuals once shielded by reputation and charm could face consequences. Civil litigation became a key tool in this broader movement, enabling survivors to be heard even when criminal law could not intervene. A quirky detail illustrates the human side of this cultural shift. Some accusers returned to former film sets or schools to share their experiences in small, closed discussions, often finding that colleagues or classmates had witnessed troubling behavior but never spoke up. It's a subtle, almost ghostly reminder that recognition doesn't erase past silence, but it does illuminate it, and that even spaces once dominated by secrecy can become grounds for conversation and reflection. Investigators still question whether Hollywood's structural changes, more HR protocols, transparency in casting, mentoring oversight, will be sufficient to prevent future misconduct. Is the Toback case a turning point, or a single lightning strike in an industry that often buries its own history? The answer remains uncertain, but one thing is clear: survivors' voices, once relegated to whispers, are now part of the permanent record, shaping expectations and policies for years to come. You feel the weight of this broader reckoning as you consider the culture Toback navigated and allegedly manipulated. Each verdict, each public discussion, and each policy shift ripples outward, touching individuals who never directly interacted with him, but who now move through a world slightly more aware, slightly more cautious, and slightly more empowered to speak. The case stands not only as a moment of civil judgment, but as a marker of cultural evolution, a quiet but persistent testament to the power of testimony over silence. Finally, you arrive at the quiet reflection on power, silence, and memory, the lingering threads that make the Toback story resonate long after headlines fade. You imagine yourself in a dimly lit room, perhaps with a cup of tea warming your hands, considering how charisma can both inspire and intimidate, how promises can be tangled with coercion, and how stories once buried can resurface decades later. James Toback's career, his films, his interviews, and the allegations against him all intersect in this complex web, revealing the subtle ways in which personal influence can become both opportunity and danger. The historical fact is undeniable. From the 1970s onward, Toback built a reputation on personal charm, scriptwriting talent, and relentless pursuit of human stories. Yet decades of accusations reveal that charisma, when unchecked, can create environments where boundaries are blurred and consent is compromised. The civil verdict in 2025, awarding $168 billion to 40 women, underscores that the legal system can, even belatedly, recognize patterns of abuse and provide restitution. The story of Toback is therefore not just one of a filmmaker, but of the cultural and institutional mechanisms that enable or resist accountability. A quirky tidbit emerges in the recollections of some accusers. They often describe Toback as paradoxically meticulous in detail, recalling conversations, clothes, or gestures with uncanny precision, almost as if he were scripting real life. That attention to detail, once praised as a filmmaker's gift, became part of the allegations, illustrating how traits celebrated in art can intersect with troubling behavior in personal interactions. Investigators still question whether memory itself is a battlefield, how recollections, documentation, and testimony interact to reveal truth in cases spanning decades. In Toback's case, hundreds of voices, corroborating patterns, and legal scrutiny combined to create a mosaic that was compelling enough for a civil jury to award a historic judgment, even without criminal convictions. The challenge of weighing decades-old memories continues to fascinate and frustrate legal and psychological observers alike. As you sit with these reflections, it becomes clear that power is never neutral. It is entwined with opportunity, reputation, and perception. Toback's story shows both the dangers of unchecked influence and the slow but persistent march of accountability. Silence can last decades, but testimony, courage, and law can eventually pierce it. You leave this narrative not with sensationalism, but with understanding, a measured acknowledgement of complexity, justice delayed but not denied, and the enduring importance of vigilance. As the story gently settles around you, imagine the dim glow of city lights through your window, the hum of life continuing beyond this quiet moment. You can almost feel the weight of what has been shared, the convergence of ambition, charm, and allegations stretching across decades. James Toback's narrative is not merely a tale of a filmmaker, but a complex study in power, the human consequences of silence, and the ways that courage, persistence, and legal reform can eventually illuminate long-hidden truths. For the women who came forward, the verdict offered recognition and a form of closure, even if the scars of experience remain. The wind down reminds you that the larger context matters. Hollywood, and society at large, continues to grapple with how charisma and influence can overshadow accountability. The Toback case exemplifies the necessity of listening to survivors, the importance of institutional responsibility, and the role of civil law in addressing harms that criminal law may be unable to remedy. Yet it also serves as a reflection on memory and time. on how events long past can shape present consciousness when testimony is finally heard and verified. In this quiet ASMR moment, you can allow yourself to process both the intensity and the lessons of the story. Power is not inherently dangerous, but unexamined, it can be misused. Silence is not neutral. It protects the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. And testimony, soft, persistent, and patient, can reshape narratives, influence institutions, and demand recognition no matter how long it takes. So, as you lean back and let the details fade into reflection, remember, vigilance, empathy, and justice are ongoing efforts. Every voice matters, every story counts, and even in the darkest corridors of influence, truth can emerge. The story of James Toback is complete here, but its echoes linger, a reminder that awareness and action are timeless.